Biscuit, old chap? Right. What have you got in your box?
This is the Book of Isis, you sly old dog. Where did you get this?
𝓂𝑒�𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒�25 building monu manstuana os and 𝓂𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑒𝑑𝑠 to mysteries of the 𝓂𝑒�𝑒𝑒 ve unvul.
A short while ago, I did a review on a collection of ghost stories from the 20th century, and at the end I mentioned that I'd also seen a similar book on mummy stories, and here it is. Lost in a Pyramid and Other Classic Mummy Stories, selected and introduced by Andrew Smith. So, the mummy story is on the surface quite shallow. When we think of a mummy story, I imagine most of us think of the film The Mummy, possibly the 2017 version with Tom Cruise, which is a remake of the 1999 one with Brendan Fraser, which in turn is a remake of the 1932 one with Boris Karloff. But actually, to get to the real heart of the mummy story, we have to go back to 1860, the golden age of the mummy, at least according to Britain. Obviously, mummies being ancient Egyptian dead people were mostly made thousands of years before, mostly from 1539 BC to 1074 BC. But in the 1860s, an important thing happened which brought the mummy to the forefront of Britain's collective mind. The building of the Suez Canal. Why? What do you think this is, a History Channel? But basically, Britain had a pretty heavy hand in Egypt in the latter half of the 19th century, not least because of all the shares that RPM of the time Disraeli had in the canal. Either way, it was around this time that the world got mummy fever. Big time. People were already using mummies as medicine, but we also got them grinding these dead guys into paint pigment, burning them as train fuel, and even mummified cats were being sold as fertilizer. The big thing, however, that became popular was to purchase a mummy and throw an unwrapping party, which I imagine is where the game Pass the Parcel comes from. These stories thankfully don't feature such weirdness. For the most part anyway, the 12 stories in this collection were published between 1869 and 1910, going from the mid-Victorian era all the way to the Edwardian, and give us a surprisingly wide range of tales considering how few types of narratives there were. The two main narratives were the curse narrative, hence your mummy films, and the romance narratives, which kind of icky, not gonna lie. These are stories of their period, and as such are a little insensitive. Some more than others. Often this is just in the form of reducing Egypt to a civilization of evil curses and sexy princesses through the narrative roles of the mummies, but some go a little bit further and others don't really touch these insensitivities at all. Definitely didn't say insensitivities properly. The other thing to note is that I don't, as a rule, get on with Victorian writing. It's why I never really read a lot of Dickens. I just can't be bothered with all those words. Thankfully, the short story is a form that calls for concision, and so the authors were forced to cut back on superfluous information. A bit, anyway. So let's dive into the 12 tales. I think most of us know Louisa May Alcott as the writer of Little Women. She did, however, also write about other darker subjects, including this little tale which is considered among the earliest of mummy stories, wherein a man tells his fiancée about the time he and his friend got lost inside a pyramid. As far as he is concerned, the story ended with their escape, but little does he realise that he has inadvertently brought a mummy's curse home. So yeah, you can't really argue with the title. 7 out of 10. A good, solid story, but sadly buried somewhat beneath the flowery writing style. The moral of the story? If you're gonna go exploring ancient tombs, maybe bring a spare torch? I can't really say much about this next author because no one knows for sure who he or she was. There are a few Schlippenbacks floating around, but Baron Schlippenback is likely a nom de plume. Either way, it's probably all for the good because this is the worst story of the lot. Essentially, some British twits go on a tourist holiday in Egypt and spend most of their time being racist towards their Arab dragomen and tour guides. They are then surprised when said tour guides, sick of being called dirty lying thieves every 5 seconds, lock them up inside a ghoul-infested tomb. I think you're supposed to feel sorry for the Brits, but, well... It is also a pretty boring story overall. The only redeeming feature was the sheer madness of the solution, but even that couldn't save a pretty anticlimactic story. 2 out of 10, don't bother. The moral of the story, don't make insulting racist remarks about the people on whom you're relying to survive. Actually, just don't make insulting racist remarks.
Do you swear?
Yes.
Oh, you shouldn't. It's not nice.
Grant Allen, who wrote this story as 𝑓𝑂𝒂, which I definitely said wrong, sounds on the surface like a really boring man. He wrote a bunch of scientific papers, including the high-octane Flashlights on Nature, a popular account of the life histories of some familiar insects, birds, plants, etc. But turns out he's actually really funny, as this story proves. It's about a man recounting the time he met a bunch of mummies. One New Year's Eve, he was bummed out because his plain, ugly fiancée caught him sneaking out to watch sexy stage shows. Goes on a midnight stroll and finds a secret entrance to a pyramid, where a bunch of resurrected mummies are having a party, including the pharaoh, who spends most of his time absolutely roasting the main character's fashion sense, and the pharaoh's hot daughter. I love this story. Not because it's particularly deep or meaningful or scary, but it is very, very funny. 10 out of 10. Great story. Would read again. The moral of the story, don't become engaged to someone you don't like just on the off chance you find a 6,000-year-old hot dead lady. Justin Huntley MacArthur was an Irish nationalist politician and MP who wrote loads about politics. Fortunately, he also wrote less boring stuff like this. Professor Petrus is another reminiscent story. Amber Pasha tells his friend about the titular professor, a leading Egyptologist who held secret lodgings in London. One day, Pasha follows him to discover the strange and terrible secrets he was hiding there. 7 out of 10. Ending felt confused, but the mystery element and the build-up were done well. And the moral of the story, remember to lock your back doors, especially if you keep dead people in your house. Again, not much is known about this author. The story, however, is the pinnacle of the traditional mummy tale. I think if you went and told people to write a story about an ancient Egyptian mummy, this is probably what they would come up with. It follows a young man whose friend and father figure unearths an undiscovered tomb. He sends the sarcophagus within to the British Museum, but learns that sometimes things are best left alone. 8 out of 10. Losers marks for the squicky insta-love between our 30-year-old protagonist and a schoolgirl. And the moral of the story, don't shoot elephants? I think everyone knows who Arthur Conan Doyle is, so I won't go into it. But what is perhaps slightly less well known about him is his interest in mysticism and the occult. Either way, he has succeeded in writing the scariest story in this book. It takes place at a university, the spookiest of settings, where one student becomes suspicious of the other living in the rooms below his. After a series of attacks, he realises his suspicions may be correct. 9 out of 10. I had hoped for a slightly more thrilling climax, but it is very good. And the moral of the story, a mummy is for life, not just for Christmas. You may have heard of Julian Hawthorne's parents. His father was Nathaniel Hawthorne, the author of The Scarlet Letter, and his mother was Sophia Hawthorne Peabody, the painter. Julian, however, is less well known, despite writing tons of stuff during his life, including memoirs of his parents, and a book complaining about prison after being jailed for a year for fraud. This story comes from a collection of related tales, wherein each is told in a restaurant called 6 Cent Sam's. This is one of the 2 reincarnation stories in this collection. The Unseen Man's story is about a mysterious man in Egypt who once found the tomb of a beautiful woman, but realised it wasn't he who found her, but her who found him. And perhaps she's still looking. 6 out of 10. I found it pretty boring, and the reincarnation stuff quite clumsy. I also loved how ancient Egyptians in this talk like Voldemort in My Immortal. Voldemort gave me a gun. No, please, I begged. Thou must, he yelled. If thou dost not, then I shall kill thy beloved Draco. How did you know? I asked in a surprised way. Voldemort got a, dude, you're so retarded look on his face. I hath telekinesis, he answered cruelly, and if you doth not kill vampire, Then thou know what will happen to Draco, he shouted. Then he flew away angrily on his broomstick. The moral of the story: stealing organs is a crime. �13�13·Pritchard were a mother and son team who often wrote as E and H Heron. Technically published as a ghost story, this is one of the weirdest tales in the collection. It's about a haunted house, but when the haunting manifests itself in a more physical manner, eventually leading to a woman's death, two men, frustrated with female hysteria, decide to take matters into their superiorly masculine hands and spend the night alone with the ghost. But is it really a ghost? Or something much more sinister? Honestly, this story has to be seen to be believed, so I'll say nothing more. But seriously, you should go and read it. The twist is so insane that you can't even guess it. It's mad. 7 out of 10. It doesn't deserve a 7, but I had to give it extra points for sheer entertainment. And the moral of the story: don't build your house on a graveyard. Sax Rohmer, nom de plume of Arthur Henry Wood, throws us into the 20th century at last. A prolific author, he is best known, unfortunately, for the Fu Manchu books. Yeah. Fortunately, this mummy story avoids racial unpleasantries. This is a bit of a stretch to be called a mummy story, but a mummy technically features, so yeah. It takes place in the Great Portland Square Museum, which is itself based on the British Museum, and describes a mysterious night where a valuable vase goes missing, along with a mummy. 8 out of 10. Quite a clever story with some lovely characterful narration. Shame about the title though. The moral of the story: never trust a man with a beard. Again, not much is known about Hester White. She may have been influenced by W.W. Jacobs' story The Monkey's Paw, published 2 years earlier, when writing her mummy tale. The dead hand follows strange happenings that begin to occur after the main character obtains a dismembered mummy hand. 6 out of 10. This unoriginal idea has been done better by other people, but it's an alright read and may well have felt fresher at its time of publication. The moral of the story: don't steal people's hands. I feel that should be obvious. Guy Boothby was a writer of detective fiction, including the Dr. Nikolai novels, ghost stories, and gothic tales. A Professor of Egyptology is the other reincarnation story, and, in my opinion, is the superior one. A young woman befriends a strange gentleman, but realises that they may have met before, a long, long time ago. 7 out of 10. I like this story, but it was missing a certain suspense or threat. The moral of the story: ask questions before you start stabbing people. Peasgood is our final author today, but sadly, again, there is very little known about her. The Necklace of Dreams, however, is the story I was looking forward to the most because there's a fancy necklace in it and I like sparkly things. A cursed necklace, which leads to the death of those who wear it, ends up in the possession of Professor Keston, who tries it on to disastrous consequences. 6 out of 10. I liked the middle section, set in ancient Egypt, but the ending really let this down for me. And the moral of the story: don't throw deadly weapons near sacred birds. I'm glad I read this collection. Not only has it made me realise that maybe I can get on with Victorian fiction in small enough doses, but it has made me look at the tradition of the mummy tale in a new way. I hadn't considered before the idea of Victorian mummy mania following the Suez Canal and all that, and mostly pictured mummy stories as being set in the 20s and 30s, after the discovery of Tutankhamun in 1922. It was strange also to compare the description of the modern-day Egyptians in these stories, mostly unfavourably characterised with ugly features and dishonourable dispositions, to the paragraphs of flowery prose dedicated to the beauty and elegance of the ancient Egyptians. An odd trademark of the Victorians, I suppose, steaming ahead with their prolific inventions whilst looking back with rose-tinted delight, whilst ignoring the needs and truths of their current time. It was interesting too to see how quickly the mummy tale broke out of its archaeological spooky thriller genre and influenced romance, mystery, crime and comedy. Overall, this collection averages a 7 out of 10, which is pretty good. And the moral of the story: don't steal stuff.
Bastard.